They called him the Shadow of New York. Asher Kane didn't have a heart. His mansion was a fortress, and his rules were absolute. Rule number 1, no strangers ever. But on a freezing Tuesday night, Belle, his terrified maid, broke that rule. She snuck her grandmother Dorothy into the mansion because she had nowhere else to go. And when Asher Kane stormed through the front doors, suit torn, knuckles bruised, fresh from whatever violence owned his night, he found an elderly woman sitting in his leather chair, humming a lullaby. 6 bodyguards drew their weapons. Red laser dots danced across the old woman's chest. Belle threw herself over her grandmother, sobbing, begging for mercy. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the worst, but instead she heard expensive fabric hit marble. She opened her eyes. The most dangerous man in New York was on his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Nana," he whispered, "you're alive." Why would a ruthless crime lord kneel before a grandmother he supposedly never met? Drop your predictions below. Hit like if you're hooked, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. But inside that sprawling, silk-lined office, the impossible reality was still unfolding. The 6 elite bodyguards stood frozen like statues carved from thick ice, unable to process the impossible scene in the center of the room. Their high-powered weapons remained firmly drawn, but their disciplined fingers hovered uncertainly over the triggers as they stared down at their boss. The man who routinely ordered brutal executions before his morning coffee was weeping openly on his own imported marble floor. Asher Kane did not even look at his lethal men, but his voice suddenly shattered the heavy, suffocating silence like a fired bullet. "Out," he roared, the single word tearing from his throat with a terrifying and raw violence. "Get out of here right now and close the doors." The heavily armed guards did not hesitate for a single second, trained to obey the Shadow of New York without question. They holstered their guns instantly and backed out of the sprawling room in complete unison. They pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind them, leaving the sharp click of the brass lock to echo loudly in the sudden quiet. Asher remained firmly on his knees, completely ignoring the throbbing pain in his split lip and the cold draft sweeping through his torn suit jacket. He finally lifted his head to look at the terrified young woman who was still desperately shielding the elderly lady. His eyes were red-rimmed and fierce, demanding an immediate explanation from the trembling maid who had just breached his impenetrable fortress. Belle could barely draw breath as she met the intense, burning gaze of the city's undisputed apex predator. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but the primal instinct to protect her grandmother forced her to speak through the terror. "I had nowhere else to take her," she gasped, her words tumbling out in a rushed and panicked whisper that echoed in the cavernous office. "The Greenfield nursing home called me at 3 in the morning because their main water pipe completely burst in the freezing winter cold." She explained how the old basement was entirely flooded, forcing the exhausted medical staff to evacuate all the fragile residents out into the blowing snow. There were simply not enough temporary beds in the city to hold everyone during such a massive winter emergency. The frantic administrator told Belle she had to come pick Dorothy up immediately, or the confused old woman would be transferred to a temporary overflow facility more than 300 miles away. Belle knew perfectly well that if Dorothy was shipped off to another state, she would lose all contact and the isolation would completely shatter her grandmother's fragile mind. She had driven her beaten car through a blinding snowstorm with a completely broken heater just to reach the sinking, chaotic nursing home in time. She had hauled Dorothy into the passenger seat with numb fingers and driven blindly back to the only place she knew. "I wanted to take her to my own home. I swear to God I did," Belle continued, hot tears now spilling rapidly down her pale, exhausted cheeks. "But I do not have a home or a life anymore." She confessed the crushing, humiliating reality of her invisible and impoverished existence to the billionaire crime lord still kneeling quietly in front of her. Her tiny Bronx apartment had been officially sealed off by the city health department nearly 3 weeks ago. Toxic black mold had crawled aggressively up the damp drywall, leaving the cramped space utterly condemned and covered in bright yellow warning tape. She had been secretly sleeping in the mansion's freezing staff quarters ever since that awful day, living quietly out of a single battered suitcase. She spent every single night praying desperately that the ruthless estate manager would not notice her illegal presence and throw her out into the bitter cold. She had absolutely no friends with spare couches to crash on, no distant relatives to call for a loan, and zero safety net to catch her when she fell. Dorothy was her entire world, the only mother she had ever known, and the only person who had ever fought for her when the brutal foster system tried to throw her away. Sneaking a sick civilian into the Mafia boss's private estate was a guaranteed suicide mission, but Belle was fully prepared to die tonight if it meant keeping her grandmother safe from the freezing streets. Through this entire frantic, tear-soaked confession, Dorothy remained perfectly calm, completely insulated from the danger by the thick and gentle fog of her advanced dementia. She did not register the massive oak doors, the heavy smell of gunpowder clinging to Asher's ruined suit, or the absolute terror radiating from her weeping granddaughter. Instead, she leaned forward slightly in the massive leather chair and reached out with her trembling, wrinkled hands. She took Asher's large, violently bruised fists into her delicate palms, her cloudy eyes tracing the fresh, bright blood resting on his cracked knuckles. "You always were a boy with sad eyes," she murmured softly, her callous thumb brushing over a deep, angry cut with infinite and unbothered tenderness. "You need to stop getting into these terrible fights, sweetheart, because it makes me worry so much." Asher closed his eyes tightly at the gentle touch, leaning his heavy head into her fragile hands as if they were the only safe harbor left in the entire world. A shuddering, jagged breath racked his broad chest, washing away 20 long years of built-up ice, blood, and underworld violence in a single, profound heartbeat. He let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the reality of her survival to fully anchor him to the present. When he finally opened his eyes again, the weeping orphan was gone, immediately replaced by a fierce, uncompromising protector who ruled an empire. "You are not going back to those freezing staff quarters," Asher stated, his voice dropping to a low, absolute decree that brokered absolutely no argument. "Neither of you is ever leaving this house again, and anyone who tries to make you will answer directly to me." The sun rose over the Kane estate, but it brought no warmth to the marble halls. The reality of the previous night had settled into the cold stone of the fortress. Asher Kane stood behind his massive oak desk with his eyes as hard as shattered glass. He summoned Briggs, his elite head of security, the man who had ordered the guns drawn on Dorothy. Briggs stood rigid and pale, attempting to offer a calculated excuse for the protocol he had followed. But the shadow of New York did not entertain excuses from men who made lethal mistakes. Asher's voice was low and entirely devoid of emotion when he spoke. "You pointed a weapon at her," he said softly. Briggs opened his mouth to apologize, but the air in the room had already turned to ice. "You're done," Asher told him with absolute finality. He fired the highly trained mercenary on the spot without a single moment of hesitation. He wanted the entire underworld to understand that zero tolerance was the only law left in his house. 10 minutes later, Belle was escorted into the very same office by 2 silent guards. She stood near the heavy wooden doors in her wrinkled maid uniform, her posture stiff and entirely defensive. She had spent the last 4 hours sitting beside Dorothy's bed, watching the elderly woman sleep peacefully while her own mind spiraled in absolute terror. Asher looked at the exhausted young woman and saw the fierce, unbroken survival instinct burning in her eyes. He stepped around his desk and closed the distance between them. "She is officially untouchable," he declared, his voice carrying the heavy weight of an unbreakable vow. "And you no longer clean floors in my house." He told her that she was under the Kane family's direct protection from this moment forward. He promised her that she would never have to worry about black mold, eviction notices, or freezing staff quarters ever again. She and Dorothy were his blood now, and they would want for absolutely nothing as long as he had breath in his lungs. Any other person in the city would have fallen to their knees and wept with overwhelming gratitude. But Belle Thornton was not any other person. She was a girl who had been systematically crushed by a brutal foster system and forced to survive entirely on her own. She had learned the hard way that miracles always arrived with a hidden, devastating price tag. Her tired eyes hardened into cold steel as she looked up at the towering crime lord. "Words are cheap, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice shaking with years of suppressed anger instead of fear. She stepped backward, deliberately putting distance between herself and his overwhelming presence. She told him that every single person who had ever promised her safety had eventually abandoned her to the wolves. Social workers, foster parents, and smiling landlords had all looked her in the eye and lied. She refused to let a man who built his empire on violence and fear be the next person to break her heart. The hardened guards stationed outside the open doors collectively held their breath, waiting for the Mafia boss to erupt into violent rage. No one in the history of the New York syndicates had ever spoken to the Shadow with such blatant disrespect and lived to tell the tale. But Asher did not explode, and his face did not twist into the terrifying mask of a killer. Instead, he looked at Belle with a deep, haunting understanding that completely disarmed her defenses. He recognized the profound, agonizing pain of abandonment radiating from her fragile frame because he carried the exact same scars in his own soul. He slowly nodded his head, accepting her fierce defiance without a single trace of anger. "You are absolutely right," he whispered, his tone softer than anyone in that house had ever heard it. "Words are entirely meaningless." He did not demand her trust or force her to accept his sudden charity. He simply promised her that he would stop talking and start showing her the absolute truth through his actions. Overnight, the Kane mansion physically transformed. The sweeping main suite was completely gutted and rebuilt into a medical-grade sanctuary for Dorothy. A state-of-the-art adjustable bed replaced the antique mahogany frame. Soft, natural light filtered through brand-new, custom curtains because Asher remembered how much she hated dark rooms. Belle found her own meager belongings transferred to a massive luxury suite in the East Wing. The room was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. A massive king bed wrapped in silk sheets sat in the center of the space. But Belle did not feel like a princess in a fairy tale. She felt like a prisoner waiting for the executioner. She locked the heavy oak door every single night and slid a sharp kitchen knife under her plush pillow. Life had ruthlessly taught her that miracles were simply traps wrapped in pretty paper. She lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the inevitable bill to arrive. But the bill did not come, and the terrifying Mafia fortress slowly bent to the will of a 78-year-old woman. Dorothy unknowingly began to rule the underworld empire from the comfort of her velvet armchair. On the third afternoon, Asher sat at the head of the massive dining table conducting a tense syndicate meeting. He had a secure phone pressed to his ear, negotiating a $2 billion shipping extortion with a ruthless overseas cartel. His voice was a deadly, frozen whisper that promised absolute destruction if his demands were not met. Suddenly, the sharp tap of a wooden cane echoed through the room. Dorothy shuffled directly up behind his chair in her faded floral apron. "Sit up straight, Asher," she scolded loudly, swatting his broad shoulder with her wrinkled hand. "You look like a common street thug slouching like that." The hardened cartel soldiers guarding the perimeter completely froze. The Shadow of New York paused his multi-billion-dollar threat and immediately straightened his spine. "Sorry, Nana," he muttered into the phone, ignoring the stunned silence of his elite killers. The disruptions did not stop there. Later that evening, Dorothy decided the undisputed king of the city needed more vitamins in his diet. A massive plate of bright green, steaming broccoli was placed directly in front of Asher at the dinner table. Asher stared at the vegetables with the exact same expression of cold disgust he reserved for his worst enemies. He firmly pushed the plate away and reached for the roasted beef. Dorothy calmly reached out and pushed the broccoli right back to the center of his placemat. Asher pushed it away again, his jaw clenching with suppressed annoyance. The third time, Dorothy did not push the plate. She simply crossed her arms and looked at him with the heavy, disappointed gaze of a mother. Asher Kane silently picked up his silver fork and ate every single piece of the steamed broccoli without uttering a single word of protest. The heavily armed bodyguards stationed at the doors exchanged bewildered glances, completely unable to process the absolute surrender of their lethal boss. Belle watched all of this unfold from the quiet periphery of the grand dining room. She sat near the edge of the table, deliberately maintaining a physical distance from the bizarre domestic scene. She bit her lower lip so hard she tasted copper because she was desperately trying not to laugh. Laughing meant dropping her guard, and dropping her guard meant inviting the pain back in. But the thick, invisible wall she had spent 24 years building was slowly beginning to crack. For the first time in the history of the Kane Empire, the mansion smelled like baked cookies instead of expensive cigars and cold fear. She saw the terrifying guards softly thanking Dorothy for warm pastries during their midnight patrols. She saw Asher looking at the old woman with a reverence that bordered on holy worship. The cold, logical part of Belle's brain screamed at her to run before the illusion shattered. But a tiny, dangerous spark was warming her exhausted heart, and she was fighting the terrifying urge to finally hope. Belle jolted awake at 2 a.m. with a violent gasp. Cold sweat clung to her skin and her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. The terrifying nightmare of 6 red laser dots dancing across Dorothy's fragile chest refused to leave her mind. She threw off the heavy silk sheets and slipped out of the massive luxury bed. She needed a glass of cold water to calm her racing pulse. She padded barefoot down the silent, shadowed corridors of the sleeping fortress. The mansion was completely quiet, but the air always felt thick with hidden danger. She turned the corner toward the industrial kitchen and suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. The bright overhead lights were blazing and a thin cloud of gray smoke hung in the air. Asher Kane stood directly in front of the massive stainless steel stove. The terrifying shadow of New York was holding a wooden spoon and staring helplessly at a pot of completely scorched oats. The man who ruthlessly dismantled rival syndicates looked entirely defeated by a simple breakfast food. He wore dark slacks and a wrinkled white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his thick elbows. Burnt milk was crusted against the side of the expensive copper pan. He did not turn his head when Belle stepped fully into the room, but his broad shoulders dropped slightly. "I am trying to remember how to make it," he whispered into the quiet kitchen. His low voice sounded incredibly fragile and completely stripped of his usual deadly authority. He confessed it was the exact same porridge Dorothy used to make for him. He told Belle about the bruised and starving 8-year-old boy hiding in a tiny Brooklyn apartment. He said he woke up to that sweet smell every single morning for 3 perfect months. It was the only taste of real safety he had ever known in his entire violent life. He desperately wanted to make it for her now, but his hands only knew how to destroy things. Belle walked quietly across the tile floor and gently nudged the Mafia boss away from the smoking burner. She pulled a clean pot from the hanging rack and set it over a low, steady flame. She poured in fresh milk and waited patiently for it to warm before adding the thick rolled oats. She handed the wooden spoon back to Asher and guided his large, scarred hand with her own. She told him to stir in slow, continuous circles so the milk would not burn to the bottom. She reached into the spice cabinet and pulled out a small glass jar. She told him the secret ingredient was a tiny pinch of ground cinnamon. She explained it was just enough to scent the warm air, but never enough to overpower the simple taste. Asher stood shoulder to shoulder with her and followed her instructions with intense, absolute focus. He watched the porridge bubble softly, and the coldness in his dark eyes completely melted away. He did not look like a feared crime lord in that brief, vulnerable moment. The sweet, familiar scent of cinnamon and warm milk finally filled the massive kitchen. Belle turned off the stove and stepped back from the counter to look at his bruised profile. She looked at the man who had ordered executions and realized he was just a broken orphan desperately looking for his mother. She took a deep breath and decided to tear down the very last of her heavy defensive walls. "She never forgot you," Belle said softly into the quiet space between them. She told him that Dorothy always talked about the lost boy with the sad eyes. She revealed the crushing, beautiful truth that she had personally witnessed her entire life. She told Asher that for 20 straight years, Dorothy sat an extra plate at their small dining table every single night. She explained that her grandmother always held out hope that the boy would eventually find his way back home for dinner. Asher's breath caught sharply in his throat and his broad chest hitched. The ruthless king of the underworld closed his eyes and let a single tear slide down his face. He finally understood that he had never been abandoned or forgotten. A fragile week of absolute peace settled over the sprawling Kane estate. The heavily fortified mansion no longer felt like a terrifying prison of marble and guns. Dorothy established a strict morning routine that no one dared to interrupt. She spent her afternoons in the industrial kitchen, surrounded by bewildered cartel chefs. She baked massive trays of chocolate chip cookies for the towering perimeter guards. The lethal mercenaries who usually snapped necks for a living now politely wiped their hands before accepting warm pastries. The entire underworld fortress bent completely to the gentle will of a 78-year-old woman. Belle finally began to let her exhausted guard down just a fraction of an inch. She started to believe that maybe the universe had finally stopped punishing her. But the brutal reality of illness did not care about fragile new beginnings. The dementia struck on a quiet Tuesday afternoon without a single warning sign. Belle carefully carried a porcelain cup of warm chamomile tea into the grand living room. She set the saucer down on the antique mahogany side table with a soft smile. Dorothy was sitting perfectly still in her velvet armchair facing the large bay windows. The elderly woman slowly turned her head and looked directly into Belle's familiar eyes. The warm light of recognition was completely gone from her clouded gaze. "Thank you very much, sweetheart," Dorothy said with a painfully polite and distant voice. "Are you one of the new maids working in the house?" The simple question tore straight through Belle's chest like a jagged piece of shrapnel. The entire world stopped spinning as the clock ticked loudly on the silent wall. Belle could not force a single word past the suffocating lump in her raw throat. She slowly backed out of the grand living room because she absolutely refused to frighten her confused grandmother. She gently pulled the heavy double doors shut behind her with violently trembling hands. Her knees completely buckled the exact second the brass latch clicked into place. She slid down the cold stone wall of the corridor and buried her face deep into her folded arms. She wept with a silent, agonizing intensity that shook her entire fragile body. Losing her parents to a sudden car crash had been a massive and defining tragedy in her young life. But losing the only mother she had ever known piece by piece was a slow and unbearable torture. She did not hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching her down the long hallway. Asher Kane stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the fiercely resilient girl broken on his floor. The most dangerous man in New York did not offer empty platitudes or useless mafia solutions. He knew that all of his billions of dollars and lethal power were absolutely worthless against this cruel disease. Asher simply lowered his massive frame down onto the freezing marble floor directly beside the weeping girl. He stretched his long legs out and pressed his broad shoulder firmly against hers. They sat together in the suffocating silence and shared the agonizing pain of losing the exact same woman. Belle finally lifted her tear-soaked face and choked out that Dorothy was disappearing right in front of them. Asher turned his head and looked at her with eyes that carried 20 years of profound grief. "Then we have to make sure every single day she is left is perfectly beautiful," he promised in a low and steady whisper, "even if she does not remember a single one of them tomorrow." The shadow of New York wrapped his strong arm around the former maid and held her together while her world fell apart. Conrad Voss sat in the shadowed corner of an underground Manhattan club, and studied the grainy photographs spread across his glass table. The underworld called him the Jackal because he was a hyper-intelligent predator who never hunted until he smelled absolute vulnerability. He had spent the last 5 years obsessively eyeing Asher Kane's $2 billion shipping empire. Voss was a sociopath dressed in bespoke Italian suits, and he firmly believed that every single man possessed a fatal flaw. But the shadow of New York had always been a terrifying anomaly with 0 family, 0 friends, and 0 weaknesses. That impossible reality completely shattered the moment Voss picked up the newest set of surveillance pictures. He stared at the impossible image of the ruthless crime lord actually smiling in a sunlit garden. Asher was tenderly guiding a fragile, gray-haired woman by the elbow as if she were made of spun glass. Voss traced a manicured finger over the old woman's face and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. He finally had the leverage he needed to completely break the unbreakable king. 30 miles away at the Kane estate, the fragile illusion of peace was slowly beginning to fracture. Belle was standing near the towering bay windows of the grand living room when her lifelong survival instincts violently kicked in. Growing up in the brutal foster system had taught her how to constantly scan her environment for hidden threats before she ever sat down. She looked past the manicured hedges and noticed a nondescript black sedan parked exactly 50 meters from the reinforced iron gates. It was sitting at the exact same predatory angle for the 3rd day in a row. She had watched the car carefully and realized there were 3 completely different drivers over the last 72 hours. The men never stepped out to stretch their legs, and they never rolled down their heavily tinted windows. They simply sat in the freezing winter cold and kept their invisible eyes fixed directly on the mansion. Her blood instantly ran cold because she knew exactly what it meant when strangers lingered quietly in the shadows. The terrifying monsters from Asher's violent world had finally found them. Belle did not hesitate or wait for the dangerous situation to escalate into a sudden bloodbath. She spun away from the cold glass and ran straight down the marble corridor toward Asher's private office. She burst through the heavy oak doors and told the Mafia boss exactly what she had seen outside his gates. Asher's face immediately hardened into a terrifying mask of pure, lethal calculation. He did not dismiss her fears or tell her she was just being a paranoid civilian. He picked up his encrypted phone and ordered his vast underworld network to run the suspicious license plates immediately. The tense silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush bone while they waited for the digital trace to complete. Within 10 minutes, his intelligence team uncovered a massive web of untraceable shell companies that all led back to a single name. Asher set the phone down on his desk and his jaw clenched with a deeply murderous rage. Conrad Voss was actively watching his family. The shadow of New York immediately triggered the highest-level security protocols, and the impenetrable fortress went on absolute high alert. Asher Kane immediately turned his sprawling mansion into a suffocating military compound. He doubled the perimeter guards and installed brand-new thermal cameras in every single blind spot. Heavily armed mercenaries patrolled the grounds in strict, overlapping shifts. The entire estate held its breath under the crushing weight of the new security protocols. But all the lethal force in the New York underworld could not stop a 78-year-old woman from taking her morning walk. Dorothy woke up and stubbornly insisted on visiting her favorite flower beds despite the absolute lockdown. She had a strict routine, and she refused to let the heavy tension in the house dictate her life. Belle volunteered to go outside and scope the freezing courtyard first to ensure it was completely safe. She stepped out into the biting winter air, and her eyes nervously swept across the frost-covered lawn. She pulled her thin coat tighter and walked straight toward Dorothy's favorite stone bench under the large oak tree. Belle stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the impossible object rusting on the cold stone. A single, freshly cut white daisy was sitting perfectly in the exact center of the bench. The delicate flower was completely out of place in the dead of the freezing winter. Belle felt her heart drop violently into her stomach as she stepped closer to the seat. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the small, folded piece of thick paper tucked neatly beneath the white petals. She opened the note and read the 4 words written in elegant, flowing black ink. "The garden is lovely, Nana." The terrifying message hit Belle like a physical blow to her chest. Someone had easily bypassed 3 layers of elite security and walked directly up to her grandmother's favorite spot. A dangerous ghost had penetrated the impenetrable fortress and left a chilling promise of violence behind. Belle did not scream or panic, but she shoved the daisy and the note deep into her coat pocket. She turned around and marched straight back into the mansion with her survival instincts burning bright. She bypassed the heavily armed guards and walked directly into Asher's private office without knocking. She pulled the crushed flower and the terrifying note out of her pocket and dropped them right onto his massive mahogany desk. Asher picked up the piece of paper and read the elegant handwriting in complete silence. He did not explode into a violent, screaming Mafia rage or flip the heavy desk over. Instead, the shadow of New York went completely, terrifyingly quiet. It was the bone-chilling calm of an apex predator meticulously calculating a massive bloodbath. He stared at the white petals and realized a lethal enemy had just bypassed every single one of his $1 million security measures. The silent promise from Conrad Voss hung heavily in the freezing air between them. Belle looked at the terrifying crime lord and refused to back down or show her fear. She knew exactly what was coming, and she knew she could not run away this time. "You do not have to fight this alone," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady in the silent room. She stood tall in front of the massive desk and looked the city's most dangerous man directly in the eyes. She was no longer just a terrified maid hiding out in the dark staff quarters. She was a fiercely resilient survivor who was completely ready to go to war for the people she loved. Asher slowly lifted his gaze and really looked at the young woman standing bravely in front of him. He did not see a fragile civilian or a dependent charity case anymore. He saw an absolute equal who carried the exact same heavy burdens he did. He gave her a single, sharp nod and quietly prepared to unleash absolute hell on his enemies. The encrypted phone on Asher's massive desk buzzed exactly at midnight. He did not hesitate before answering because he knew exactly who was on the other end of the secure line. Conrad Voss spoke with a voice that was perfectly smooth and terrifyingly polite. He sounded like a wealthy man casually ordering an expensive glass of wine at a 5-star restaurant. He casually complimented the beautiful landscaping of the Kane estate before delivering his absolute ultimatum. He demanded total and immediate control of all East Coast shipping routes. It was a massive $2 billion concession that would completely shift the balance of power in the New York underworld. Voss did not raise his voice or issue a screaming threat. He simply took a slow sip of whatever expensive liquor he was drinking and made a cold promise. He said that if Asher did not sign over the massive empire by tomorrow night, he would personally pay Nana a visit. The line went completely dead before Asher could even take a breath. The shadow of New York slowly placed the heavy phone back on its receiver and prepared to go to war. Asher immediately summoned Belle and Dorothy into his private office under the heavy cover of darkness. He stood rigidly behind his mahogany desk and did not offer them comfortable seats. He looked at the 2 women who had unknowingly become his entire world and issued a direct Mafia command. He ordered them to pack a single bag of essentials immediately. He explained that a team of 10 elite mercenaries was currently waiting in the armored garage to extract them both. They were going to be driven to a highly secure and completely invisible safe house in upstate New York. He promised them they would have around-the-clock protection while he stayed behind in the city to finish Conrad Voss. He spoke in the absolute, uncompromising tone that made seasoned cartel bosses tremble in fear. He fully expected the terrified maid and the fragile grandmother to obey him without a single question. But he had fundamentally underestimated the fierce resilience of the family he had accidentally found. Dorothy stood perfectly straight and looked at the towering crime lord with absolutely zero fear in her clouded eyes. She lifted her polished wooden cane and struck the heavy marble floor with a sharp and deafening crack. "No," she said, and that single word filled the massive room with an unbreakable, maternal authority. She told him that she had spent 20 long and agonizing years mourning the loss of a little boy with sad eyes. She firmly declared that she was never leaving his side again, no matter how many monsters were hiding in the dark outside his gates. Belle stepped firmly upright behind her grandmother and crossed her arms over her chest. The girl who had spent her entire life running from danger looked the most dangerous man in the city directly in the eye. "I am staying too," Belle promised with a voice that did not tremble or shake. She told him that family did not run away and hide when the absolute worst finally happened. Asher opened his mouth to argue fiercely, but the desperate words completely died in his throat. He looked at the two stubborn women and realized that all of his lethal power was utterly useless against their deep love. He could command an entire empire of ruthless killers, but he could not force his true family to abandon him. A profound and terrifying acceptance slowly washed over his scarred face as he finally nodded his head. He accepted their fierce defiance and immediately turned the luxury mansion into a literal war zone. He ordered his heavily armed men to barricade the heavy front doors and lock down every single point of entry. He personally went down into the freezing basement and fully armed the reinforced steel safe room. He meticulously loaded heavy weapons and stockpiled enough ammunition to survive an absolute bloodbath. The Kane estate was no longer just a gilded cage or a comfortable home. It was a deadly fortress waiting for a violent siege, and they were all going to stand their ground together. The next night brought a beautiful and fragile illusion of absolute normalcy to the Kane estate. The massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden light over the heavy oak dining table. 3 plates of hot food sat close together at one end of a table meant for 12. Dorothy was completely lucid and her bright eyes sparkled with genuine joy. She was happily telling a story about catching an 8-year-old Asher stealing cookies from the top shelf of her tiny kitchen. She laughed as she described finding the future crime lord hiding under the table with his mouth completely full of sweet crumbs. Asher actually threw his head back and let out a deep and genuine laugh that echoed through the marble room. Belle smiled widely and let the beautiful sound wash over her exhausted heart. They felt like a real family enjoying a perfectly safe and ordinary dinner together. But peace was the most fragile thing in the Mafia world, and Conrad Voss was done waiting. The massive dining room windows suddenly exploded inward with a deafening and violent roar. A deadly hail of shattered glass and flying bullets instantly shredded the elegant room. The beautiful crystal chandelier took a direct hit and crashed violently onto the marble floor. The impact plunged the dining room into complete darkness, lit only by the terrifying flashes of muzzle fire from outside. Conrad Voss did not send a simple hit squad to do this job. The Jackal had deployed a highly trained paramilitary platoon of 30 elite mercenaries. They hit 3 carefully calculated blind spots in the perimeter simultaneously and completely overwhelmed the outer guards. The sheer volume of automatic gunfire sounded like a raging thunderstorm tearing through the walls of the fortress. The air instantly filled with choking white smoke and the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood. Asher reacted with pure lethal instinct before the first piece of glass even hit the floor. He surged upward and violently flipped the massive oak dining table completely onto its side. He used the heavy wood as a temporary barricade against the relentless storm of flying bullets. He grabbed Belle and Dorothy with his strong hands and dragged them fiercely down onto the cold stone. He threw his own massive body directly over the 2 terrified women to completely shield them from the deadly shrapnel. Sharp shards of crystal rained down and sliced viciously into the back of his expensive suit jacket. But the Shadow of New York did not flinch or make a single sound of pain. He simply pressed his family deeper into the floor and waited for a 1-second break in the heavy firing. He knew exactly what was happening, and his brain coldly calculated the only possible escape route. Deafening emergency alarms began to scream violently through every single hallway of the breached mansion. Asher grabbed Belle by the wrist and locked his other arm tightly around Dorothy's fragile waist. "Move right now," he roared over the terrifying sound of shattering stone and dying men. He hauled the two women up from the floor and dragged them desperately toward the west corridor. Thick white smoke burned their lungs and completely blinded their terrified eyes. Asher fired his handgun into the dark shadows and dropped two masked mercenaries who tried to block their frantic path. Blood sprayed across the expensive silk wallpaper as the brutal reality of the underworld violently invaded their home. Dorothy coughed terribly, but her feet kept moving to the fast and frantic rhythm of her wooden cane. Asher fought a bloody and relentless retreat through the chaotic darkness. He pushed his family forward step by agonizing step toward the reinforced steel doors of the basement safe room. They reached the end of the narrow west corridor with their lungs burning from the thick white smoke. Asher slammed his bloody palm directly onto the glowing biometric scanner set into the stone wall. The heavy steel door hissed and slid open heavily to reveal the reinforced concrete safe room. He immediately pushed Belle and Dorothy toward the dark entrance to get them out of the direct line of fire. He turned back and hit the heavy emergency lockdown button to seal the impenetrable vault. Nothing happened. He slammed his fist against the glowing panel a second time, but the small screen only flashed a violent red. A mechanized voice calmly announced a complete system error through the overhead speakers. Conrad Voss was a highly intelligent sociopath who did not leave a single detail to chance. The Jackal had deployed a team of elite hackers to completely disable the mansion's internal security mainframe. The heavy steel door could still be pulled shut, but the magnetic locking mechanism was completely dead. The impenetrable sanctuary was suddenly nothing more than a concrete tomb if left entirely unguarded. Asher looked down at the blinking red light and his blood turned completely to ice. He knew instantly that any of the heavily armed mercenaries could simply pull the door wide open and slaughter everyone inside. He did not hesitate or waste a single second trying to fix the broken electronics. He grabbed Belle by her trembling shoulders and shoved her forcefully into the dark center of the safe room. He gently guided Dorothy right in behind her and positioned them safely behind a thick concrete barrier. But the Shadow of New York did not step across the steel threshold to join them in the dark. He stood perfectly still in the smoky hallway and checked the remaining ammunition in his single handgun. He knew that the only way to keep the heavy door closed was to kill every single man trying to reach it. He was a man who had built an entire empire on ruthless violence and cold calculation. But in that terrifying moment, he was simply a son preparing to completely sacrifice himself for his mother. Dorothy turned around and immediately realized that the tall crime lord was not following them inside. The terrifying fog of her dementia completely lifted and her cloudy eyes suddenly became razor-sharp with pure panic. She rushed back toward the heavy steel frame and reached her wrinkled hands out toward his blood-stained shirt. "You are not coming inside with us," she said, her voice shaking violently with the absolute terror of a mother losing her child. She begged him desperately not to leave her alone again after she had spent 20 long years crying for him. Asher reached out and gently caught her trembling hands in his own bruised palms. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and offered her the most beautiful and heartbreaking lie of his entire life. "I will be right behind you, Nana," he whispered softly over the deafening sound of approaching gunfire. They both looked at each other and instantly recognized the absolute finality hidden in his quiet words. Asher slowly released her fragile hands and pulled the massive steel door completely shut between them. The heavy click of the metal latch sealed his true family safely away in the darkness. He finally turned his broad back to the safe room and faced the long, smoke-filled corridor completely alone. Heavy and organized footsteps thundered loudly against the marble floors as a squad of 8 elite killers marched relentlessly toward his position. The red beams of their laser sights cut through the thick white smoke like terrifying ghost lights. Asher Kane lifted his single handgun and planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the bloody stone floor. He was completely outgunned and bleeding heavily from the deep cuts on his broad shoulders. But the Shadow of New York felt absolutely zero fear as he stared down the barrel of certain death. He had finally found something worth dying for, and he was completely ready to drag every single one of Vasso's men straight to hell with him. The dark corridor instantly erupted into a deafening storm of lethal violence. Asher Kane moved with the terrifying speed of a predator fighting for its life. He raised his heavy handgun and fired 3 precise shots into the thick white smoke. The first 2 masked mercenaries dropped violently to the cold marble floor before they could even pull their triggers. The remaining killers returned fire with a brutal barrage of automatic bullets that chipped the stone walls into flying shrapnel. Asher dove tightly against a wide concrete pillar for temporary cover and quickly reloaded his weapon. He managed to take down 2 more advancing men with ruthless and lethal accuracy. But the Shadow of New York was rapidly running out of ammunition, and the relentless enemy kept pushing forward. A stray bullet grazed his broad right shoulder and tore a burning path through his expensive torn suit. He gritted his teeth against the sudden blinding pain and mentally prepared to die on his own blood-stained floor. The terrifying sound of heavy gunfire was suddenly pierced by something completely impossible. The sharp and steady tap of a wooden cane echoed clearly over the deafening chaos. Asher watched in absolute horror as the heavy steel door of the safe room slid wide open. Dorothy stepped calmly out into the smoke-filled war zone in her faded floral dress. Her frail 78-year-old body stood perfectly straight, and her clouded eyes burned with an incredibly fierce fire. She did not flinch or cower away from the terrifying red laser sights cutting through the dark air. She walked directly into the center of the crossfire and placed herself firmly between the deadly mercenaries and the bleeding crime lord. She lifted her polished wooden cane and pointed it directly at the heavily armed killers. "You will not touch my son," she declared with a voice that carried the heavy weight of absolute maternal fury. The sheer and impossible shock of an elderly woman scolding them in a gunfight made the highly trained assassins freeze for one crucial second. That single second of human hesitation was exactly all Asher Kane needed to react. He exploded from behind the concrete pillar and lunged desperately across the open space. He threw his massive body violently forward to completely shield Dorothy from the remaining gun barrels. A deafening crack ripped through the smoke just as he wrapped his strong arms around her fragile frame. A heavy-caliber bullet slammed directly into Asher's left shoulder and spun him brutally around. The devastating impact shattered bone and instantly turned his entire arm completely numb. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, but he refused to let go of his terrified grandmother. He pressed her safely against the cold wall and gasped for burning air as his own blood poured onto the marble floor. He lifted his heavy gun with his trembling right hand to finish the remaining attackers. But a final sniper suddenly stepped out from the deep shadows and aimed a long rifle directly at Asher's exposed back. Belle watched the terrifying scene unfold from the dark doorway of the open safe room. She had absolutely no weapons and zero combat training to save the man who had just taken a bullet for them. But the fiercely resilient maid refused to stand by and watch her new family be slaughtered. She spun around and grabbed a heavy $30,000 ceramic vase from the emergency supply shelf. She gripped the antique pottery with both hands and sprinted right out into the dangerous hallway. She hurled the heavy ceramic violently through the air and screamed in pure and desperate defiance. The massive vase crashed directly into the sniper's head and shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The brutal impact completely ruined his lethal aim and sent his final bullet safely into the stone ceiling. The brief distraction gave Asher exactly enough time to raise his weapon and land one final and lethal shot. The last enemy dropped heavily to the floor, and the violent corridor instantly fell completely silent. The Shadow of New York looked back at the 2 women who saved him and finally collapsed into a dark pool of his own blood. The first thing Asher noticed was not the burning agony in his shattered shoulder, but the faint and sweet smell of cinnamon. He slowly opened his heavy eyes and found himself lying in a sterile medical bed set up directly in the center of his own master bedroom. Sunlight spilled warmly through the tall windows and illuminated the exhausted girl sitting completely still in the chair beside him. Belle looked like she had not slept for a single second since the violent attack, but her amber eyes were fiercely resolute. She saw him waking up and immediately leaned forward with a calm that completely belied her 24 years of age. She did not ask him how he felt or offer him empty words of comfort. She simply told him in a cold and flat voice that his loyal men had found Conrad Voss exactly 3 hours after the brutal gunfight. She stared directly into the eyes of the city's most dangerous mafia boss and promised him that the jackal was no longer a problem. Asher gave her a single and slow nod because he knew that in his dark world those words meant the absolute end of the war. The heavy bedroom door suddenly pushed open, and the sharp tap of a wooden cane echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. Dorothy marched straight into the room carrying a small tray of warm porridge and a face full of absolute, furious tears. She set the tray down forcefully on the nightstand and immediately began scolding the terrifying crime lord for acting like a foolish hero. She told him that he had nearly gotten himself killed and that she absolutely refused to bury another child in her lifetime. Asher did not argue or try to defend his reckless and violent actions in the dark corridor. He simply reached out with his uninjured right arm and gently took her trembling, wrinkled hand into his own. He looked up at the fierce 78-year-old woman and smiled a remarkably soft and genuine smile. It was the exact same innocent smile of the broken 8-year-old boy she had saved in a freezing Brooklyn alley 20 years ago. He squeezed her delicate fingers and quietly promised her that there would be absolutely no more running for any of them. Asher slowly turned his dark head against the white pillow and looked deeply at the resilient young woman standing quietly by the window. He did not need to use cheap words to call her his family anymore because her incredibly brave actions had already proven it beyond any doubt. She had thrown a heavy ceramic vase at an armed sniper with her bare hands just to save a man she barely knew. Belle looked back at the bleeding boss and felt the last remaining brick of her massive defensive wall finally crumble into dust. She realized with a sudden and overwhelming peace that she did not need to sleep with a knife under her pillow ever again. She had spent her entire miserable life believing that miracles always came with a devastating price tag and that everyone would eventually abandon her. But she looked at the fiercely protective man in the bed and the loving grandmother holding his hand, and she finally understood the beautiful truth. She had finally found a permanent home in the most dangerous and unexpected place in the entire world. Family was never just a meaningless promise spoken in the dark. Family was simply the people who stubbornly refused to leave when absolutely everything else broke into pieces. The Shadow of New York finally learned that real strength was never measured by the massive criminal empire you commanded or the heavily armed men standing outside your door. True power was found entirely in the people you were willingly ready to kneel before and bleed for. A simple act of unconditional kindness planted in a dark alley 20 years ago had miraculously bloomed and saved 3 different lives in a violent hallway. This is where Asher, Belle, and Dorothy's story comes to an emotional end on Sunni romance. Their intense journey reminds all of us that the universe will always find a beautiful way to reward a truly compassionate heart. It teaches us that shared trauma and mutual sacrifice can easily forge a bond that is infinitely stronger than any bloodline. I want to ask you an important question before you leave this video today. Which incredible moment of sacrifice in this dark and emotional story touched your heart the absolute most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below because we truly love reading every single one of your beautiful insights. Thank you so much for watching and staying with us until the very end of this amazing journey. Remember to cherish the people who stand bravely by your side in the dark, and we will see you again in the next video.